Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you back for another episode of the Compliance Report International Edition, where we have, yet again, Compliance Man Goes Global. Today with Episode 8, which are Tough Questions. As always, I'm joined by my colleague in this series, Timur Khasanov-Batirov, who has also developed the Compliance Man Illustrated series. In each episode of Compliance Man Goes Global, we take on a question, or rather a myth, about the compliance practice and the compliance profession in emerging markets. We consider two questions and take pros and cons of each, hopefully giving the compliance practitioner in emerging markets ideas on how to do compliance going forward, but also for the compliance practitioner in the United States or the United Kingdom to help understand some of the challenges that may be different in an emerging market as opposed to a country with a more mature compliance program going forward. Today we focus on some questions around budgeting and resources available to the compliance function. I think you'll find it a very interesting episode and lots of good points that Tim and I share. As always, check out the Compliance Man Illustrated series that goes along with this podcast. This is Tom Fox. The Compliance Report International Edition is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, back for another episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. Today in Episode 8, along with my colleague Timur Khasanov-Batirov, we take up the issue of tough questions. And I think you will find this one a really interesting episode. For those who don't know our process protocol and what we go through, we take a look at questions that compliance officers need to address. We explore them in plain language and in a simple game form. So to try to make this podcast illustrative and useful going forward. And Tim has also created Compliance Man, which is an illustrated series he's put together. And we have an illustrated Compliance Man episode that will be posted with this podcast as well. So what we do is we take a couple of concepts, or really misconceptions, from the in-house compliance perspective, and we check them out to see if they work in emerging markets. Our focus here is not the United States, it's emerging markets, and that's why Tim is so instrumental in this, because he has worked in emerging markets in Ukraine, in Russia, in Central Asia, in a wide variety of countries for over 17 years as a compliance practitioner. The way we do this is one of us will identify a pro, and then the other will take the con perspective. And like I said, today is on tough questions. So Tim, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, why don't we just jump right into it?
Yes, sir. Sounds great.
Okay. Compliance myth number 1. Does a decrease in a compliance department's budget significantly affect its effectiveness? Tim, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, Tom, I believe it's a tricky question. I think it depends. Obviously, compliance officer should have resources to do his job. Well, the question is that what we consider as an adequate level of resources or budget. Consequently, we need to deploy criteria which could be used for estimates. In my view, the best algorithm will be the following. First, to define scope of applicable regulatory requirements. Second, to conduct risk assessment. Third, to plan activities which will tackle high-risk regulatory requirements. This, for instance, might be related to implementation of the 10 hallmarks of the effective compliance program. And third and fourth, the last one, to estimate respective budget. Thus, in my opinion, mere fact that department's budget is decreased or increased doesn't say anything. First, you have to look whether you have funds to address key priorities. Another thing to mention is allocation of resources. For instance, in my view, due to creation of different apps and software, compliance staff is in position to create training video itself, significantly cutting costs on expensive video production. Probably you will not become Oscar winner for your video, but it's not your goal. One more tip for compliance practitioner is to approach HR, PR, or maybe communications teams to check out if they might be interested to conduct joint activities with compliance department. In the ideal scenario, they might finance your projects, as for instance, contest for personnel or knowledge of corporate ethics code. In this case, both HR and compliance departments will find themselves in a win-win situation. Tom, you write often about compliance departments' effectiveness. What will be your recommendations or tips when we refer to budget cutting topic?
So, Tim, you really bring up I would say more than interesting, but a very difficult question. And coming from Houston, Texas, and in the energy industry, unfortunately, we have had this exact situation over the past several years. So I'd like to maybe take this in a different direction, because the reality of the corporate world is that you're going to have your budget cut from time to time. And if your industry sector is in a downturn, or if your company is in a downturn, you're going to have to share the pain with the rest of the corporate functions, and you're going to take a budget cut. And the question is, what do you do when your budget's cut? And you really laid out, I thought, 2 or 3 excellent tactics that a compliance officer would use, certainly utilizing a video, utilizing your in-house resources, particularly like your idea of going to HR and working with HR. But let me see if I could maybe take it a step further when not only is your budget cut, but you lose employees, or what we would say your headcount goes down. And you've got to figure out a way to manage the risks with the reduced budget. Now, the thing that makes this an incredibly difficult question is the Department of Justice really doesn't care too much, frankly, about the state of your company, the profitability of your company, the profitability of your industry. And in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, they specifically call out funding and resources as one of the key questions that they would ask if a company is under an FCPA investigation. So the questions they would pose are as follows. How have decisions been made about the allocation of personnel and resources for compliance and the relevant control functions in light of the company's risk profile? Have there been times when requests for resources by compliance and relevant control functions been denied? If so, how have those decisions been made? It certainly doesn't say you cannot cut resources, but it does say that there must be a pretty good reason and documentation of that reason. But then moving on to what can you do? Here in Houston, budgets in 2014, 2015, when the price of oil cratered, were fairly dramatically cut, including compliance. And many compliance officers were faced with the choice of less money and less resources. So the decision by many was the following: do less with less. And I know that might sound counterintuitive, but what they meant were, and how they put that phrase into practice, was to actually do less overall, but focus more on your 2 or 3 highest risks. So one of the things you continually talk about, Tim, is risk ranking in a wide variety of compliance issues. And here you would simply fall back on your risk ranking for your highest risk. That could be third-party sales agents. That could be a geographic risk. That could be a particular customer. Could be a country or industry sector, whatever that might be, and manage that risk with the resources you have. And really focus on, as the compliance officer, it forces you to focus on what are our company's risks and how can we manage those risks with the resources we have. Now, the sort of good news from the energy industry perspective is the price of oil is now over $60 a barrel. Resources are beginning to be reallocated. Monies are beginning to be funded to the compliance departments. So they've had 2 or 3 years here where they've really had to focus on their top resources, their top risks, and now they're able to focus on other risks. So if you think about and force yourself to think about what are our risks, what are our top 3 risks, and manage those top 3 risks, then you can weather the storm when budgets are cut. So you really can come out stronger and perhaps with a actually more robust compliance program.
I fully agree with you, Tom. Yeah, this is a risk-based approach. This is something which I believe can save you, can help you in being at the emerging markets as well. Thank you for this tip.
So, Tim, let me move to myth number 2 because I find this really equally interesting. So here's myth number 2. We have adopted internal policies. Now we can save on hiring highly qualified and highly paid compliance personnel. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Tom, in this case, I would strongly disagree with this concept. What I have seen in practice at emerging markets that unfortunately, in many cases, compliance professionals are viewed solely as internal policymakers. Thus, the misconception you have mentioned is based on this presumption. The problem that in this scenario, all other key elements of compliance program, as for instance, top management engagement or communications, risk assessments, etc., are kind of getting out of picture. The sad part that even if we refer to policy making, the essential part of it is policy implementation, which becomes impossible in absence of other mentioned elements. To manage compliance risks at high-risk markets, the company should hire a person who would be able to demonstrate ability in deploying all elements of the effective compliance program. So that is my view, Tom. What do you think?
Well, Tim, this is actually an area that the Department of Justice has spoken to directly a couple of times. First of all, in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, they specifically called out that compliance personnel must have appropriate experience and qualifications for the role. Also, that the compliance function must be functionally compared with other strategic functions in the company in terms of stature within the organization, in terms of compensation level, in terms of your corporate ranking or title, your resources, the access to key decision-making personnel. So the government has recognized that the pay is actually quite important. And so you simply can't put a program in place and then kind of wash your hands of it and hire an unqualified person. If you do, you will be heavily sanctioned by the government. So here's, I think, one area where the government really gives the compliance profession some significant backing, because the government understands you must have not only a highly qualified and highly compensated compliance professional, but one that really has, it's not even with a high salary and no authority, it's someone who has a commensurate salary with commensurate authority to the general counsel or someone such as that. So it's important that the company be able to demonstrate those as well. Now, as to the non-chief compliance officer, sort of everyone else in the compliance department, the critical component there, Tim, is, are they qualified? Have they had training as compliance officers? Do they have a certification? Have they gone to one of the certification companies? Have they learned on the job? Certainly, corporations promote people and move people around. Nothing wrong with that. But if you take someone who's never done anything close to compliance, put them in the compliance function and do not give them any training, that's going to be viewed negatively. It's going to help to have the certifications I mentioned earlier, and there's several companies that do this. So it's important that the chief compliance officer be qualified and paid commensurately with other senior personnel, even if that's highly paid. But also the rest of the people in your compliance function must be adequately trained if they don't have that internal training, and they must be effective, and they must receive ongoing training going forward. So let me kind of end it with this scenario for you, Tim, which is under this myth, if a company decided the chief compliance officer was a cost they did not want to have, and the general counsel could certainly do that work, so they'll just get rid of the chief compliance officer and put that job with the general counsel. Now, every company's got a general counsel, certainly important role. But the job of a general counsel is very different than that of a chief compliance officer. The job of a general counsel is to protect the company. The job of a chief compliance officer is prevent, detect, and remediate problems that come up. So if the government sees that, then they ask the next question is, well, how much compliance expertise does the general counsel have? Does the general counsel have a compliance certification? Does the general counsel routinely receive continuing legal training? I would say certainly in the United States, that's a requirement. Okay. Does the general counsel routinely receive ongoing compliance training? Well, the answer to that is going to be probably not. So just from that basic scenario, you see that how difficult it is when you combine those roles and you don't give the general counsel, the chief compliance officer, not only the authority, but the commensurate stature within an organization. So, we've taken on some, I thought, pretty interesting and difficult questions today. Do you have any key takeaways for our audience, Tim?
Yes, Tom, I made some notes, and these are those notes. The first thing, in downturn times, you as compliance person share the pain with other corporate departments in terms of the budget cutting. However, you should focus on at least 2-3 highest risks to mitigate the threat to the organization. In terms of the compliance officers and the resources which they have, I made some notes as well. So thanks for elaborating on the government requirements towards compliance profession within the organization. So as you have said, the compliance department should be functionally compared to other departments. Compliance personnel and chief compliance officer has to have an adequate authority, and the personnel has to be qualified. This is very important for many emerging markets where it's not a big news to have a chief compliance officer. The question which will arise, whether the organization could prove that the criteria you have mentioned are tackled. So for me, it was a very important and interesting discussion. Touched, as you have said, very tough questions. Thanks, Tom, for your tips and recommendations.
Well, this has been a really interesting discussion, Tim, and we may have to actually take this one up on another episode. But I hope our audience will join us again for another episode, our next episode of Compliance Man Goes Global, and where we will bust some more corporate compliance myths. Thanks very much. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Compliance Report International Edition with episode 8 of Compliance Man Goes Global. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only compliance podcast which focuses on doing compliance outside of the United States. I hope you will join us again next week when Timur Khasanov-Batirov and I bust more compliance myths on Compliance Man Goes Global. The Compliance Report International Edition is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.